So friends, in this part of the discussion, we will take up the question of history, which is called tradition by TS Eliot, and there will be a comment by Professor Payal Nagpal on this essay, the points that have been made by Eliot, and of course the variety of poetic expression through the 20th century, and the meaning that it creates for us to consider. So I request Professor Payal Nagpal to extend her points further.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So we started by talking about the first part of this essay where Eliot is dwelling on the term tradition. And so he says that, and you at the end of the previous lecture, you raised a very important point about the world wars. And I think when we look at the turn of the century, there is a desire to completely break away. And whether it is, because if you look at this essay, it's probably coming immediately after the First World War, 1914 to 18 being the war, and 1919. So there is a certain change, a desire in that sense to understand the process of history, and so in this sense, early modernism would be slightly different from high modernism. So because he says here that tradition is not handing down or simply following the ways of the previous generation, and he says that if by tradition we mean that we have to follow the ways of the previous generation, then this kind of tradition should be totally discouraged. So, and he says that the genuine idea of tradition, he says you acquire it with great effort, it can't be inherited. So there is a role that he accords, I think, to the writer here, and that role is of a historical sense. So it is not simply imitating, but to understand and to carry that sense of history, and he defines it very clearly. He says this historical sense involves a perception. The famous lines, I think, in this essay, which we have quoted many a time, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. So early modernism, where there is a break, and we say that this period till about 1900 should just totally be done away with. And here is a moment where we say that historical sense should be there, not only the pastness of the past, but of its presence. And according to Eliot, it is the historical sense that compels the writer not only to write with his own generation, but with the feeling that he's carrying, the writer is carrying with her or him the entire literature in a sense of the past. And so this, he says, is a sense of the timeless as well as that of the temporal. And this is what makes, he says, a writer traditional. So he's totally reversed this, and he's probably deliberately using the word tradition because, as discussed, early modernism meant a total rejection of the past. And I think in the post-First World War scenario, there is a change and there is a need to understand, really speaking, the process of history and how that process of history is reflected in writing, in literature, and especially in poetry, because T.S. Eliot is certainly, of course, he's written plays also, but he's really known for his poetry, and especially the poetry of high modernism. So changes then, I mean, what is being rejected is then realism, and in a sense, the poet still holds dialogue with the past and with the present times. So Eliot then indicates how poetry as a genre was really speaking in the spotlight, and the difference then between the present and the past is, he says that the conscious present is an awareness in a sense of the past. And in the second part, he moves on to, I think, the second part of the title of his essay, which is individual talent. And he moves to the idea of what he calls a certain kind of depersonalization. And he points out, he says that, he points out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors. I think this constant reference in different manifestos and, by T.S. Eliot and so on, I think the term poet and poem keeps emerging to tell us that, yes, the spotlight certainly is on poetry, and poetry is a very important genre. The writers are the fractured times. The World War really shook the world in a certain sense. So to understand the collapse of structures, to understand what was happening in the world, I think poetry is a genre that really appealed to the writers. And so he talks about the relation of the poem to other poems and so on. And then he moves on to the seminal question of what then is the relationship between the poet and the poem. So, and here he calls the mind of the poet to be a catalyst. And he says that the mind is supposed to kind of bring the different images together in a sense, and has to be like a catalyst in a chemical reaction. And so the elements that enter, he says, in the presence of this transforming catalyst, he says these are of two kinds. One is emotions and the other are feelings. So the poet's mind, in a sense, is seen as a kind of medium. It is seen as a kind of receptacle that stores feelings, phrases, images, he says. And, the final product is then not an expression of the poet's personality. And he says, for my meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Now, this I find interesting, and I request you also to share your views on this, because I think the modernist period, as we discussed, makes the individual the cornerstone of this particular movement. And T.S. Eliot has very beautifully not only used this particular cornerstone of the individual, but also connected it, given it a sense of history, and at the same time depersonalized to, almost it's like undercutting any aura or any sense of, the poet being the poet.
I think T.S. Eliot in the early part of the 20th century was ranging himself, pitching himself against Romanticism. For the Romantic, the individual poet was important. So it was his feeling, it was his idea, it was his experience, and he was looking at the world, the Romantic poet, and most of them were men. He was looking at the world critically and rejecting it, and also presenting a kind of alternative scheme of things. So Eliot seemed to be sharply critical of this idea that the poetry actually is the expression of the poet's personality, which you have rightly defined as poet's personality, or personality that is being shaped by a certain structure in society. So that's one point. Secondly, Eliot would say that a poet would be actually a medium, a kind of container in which the expressions are of course the defining principle, but finally it's the experience that is being poured into the utensil, yes, into the kind of a mode, and in that mode it assumes a kind of a form. So he was, I think, being slightly classicist in his idea, right, that the poet actually is in the hands of the circumstance, and circumstances compel him to say things in a certain manner, but then the poet is able to say those things in his individual fashion. So he was trying to combine, yes, the poet as a critical person who is allowing, who is also criticizing himself and allowing the outer forces to enter his mind, and then come out in their own distinct form. So I think as far as the understanding of poetry is concerned, it's more sophisticated than the understanding that was projected in the 19th century by the Romantic artists. That said, Eliot was also entertaining certain prejudices against history, and in fact, it's calling it not history but tradition, was the way that he suggested, and for that, the best example is his own poem, Wasteland, where the historical characters assume the modern form, so that the kind of modernism comes in. So there is a typist girl, yes, and there are passages from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and those passages draw Cleopatra nearer the typist girl than the historical person, who was historical also for Shakespeare. Cleopatra belonged to the ancient period. So he was in a way playing with the idea of history as funny and to be criticized. So he's a different ball game, a different kettle of fish. On a modernist.
Yes. On a critical note then, in that sense, of course, I mean, even if one looks at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, one way of reading it would be just to look at the innumerable intertextual references. It's almost like translating his idea of tradition, what he calls it, in poetry, and to kind of bring in so many intertextual references, that would actually be one way of reading the poem. And of course there are the critical mode would actually be different, really speaking. So yes, and he looks at the poet as a kind of receptacle, is the word that he uses. So he says impressions and experiences which are important for the man may play no place in the poetry, and those that become important in the poetry may play a negligible part in the person's personality. So he says the business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones, and in working them up into poetry. Now, actually, having said this, so we have different manifestos, we have so many different poets, and I'll also refer to two more points of view, in a sense, on poetry. But they were each poet, I think, like each particular group that was coming up with a new ism at the turn of the century. Similarly, of course, modernism remains that blanket term that describes the experiments and changes that were happening at this time. But each poet, of course, understands poetry and writes it in their own way. So Eliot, of course, talks about the role of the poet in using ordinary emotions and working them up in poetry to express feelings which are not in actual emotions, and emotions that he has never experienced will serve his turn as well as those that are familiar. And you rightly pointed out about how Eliot, of course, rejects the romantic notion, and so he says that we must believe that emotion recollected in tranquility is an inexact formula. So here he just puts it out there, and I think this gives us to for this series on 20th century poetry the entire debate about Wordsworth's statement about poetry as emotions recollected in tranquility. So here he says it is neither emotion nor recollection, nor without distortion of meaning, tranquility. So what is it for Eliot? And being the modernist poet, it is a concentration, he says, and a new thing resulting from the concentration of a vast number of experiences. So it is a concentration which he says does not happen consciously or in a deliberate sort of manner. Of course, we also have, at this point of time, early 20th century, there was a very interesting lecture by T.E. Hume, which was titled A Lecture on Modern Poetry. And again, this is very telling, the title of the lecture itself, because it tells us about how, and there was a poets club, in 1908, he had delivered this lecture there. And he had very clearly said that versification belongs to a particular time period. And as the time changes, there is a need for versification also to change. So the need of the 20th century, according to him, was to move to free verse. So he says, this is from the lecture, that he says there is an intimate connection between the verse and state of poetry at any period. And he says, verse forms, like manners and like individuals, develop and die. And they evolve from their initial freedom, decay, and so on. They disappear before the new man, burdened with thought, can kind of express anything. So he says all the tunes have been played. But what is the modern then for Hume? And this is again very early modernism. He says the modern is the exact opposite of this. It does not deal with heroic action. It has become introspective and deals with expression and communication of momentary phases in the poet's mind. So here we can of course see connections, and this he says from the standpoint of what he calls extreme modernism. He says what are these principal features? He says something very interesting. He's saying the whole idea of soulful poetry, of poetry as religion, is not to be presented, and he says poetry is that is read and not chanted. So he I think this readability and the ability to communicate is something that he brings in here, and he says that we should not cramp it with it should with meter. So and finally there's a very important phrase by Hume. He says the shell must be broken. So he says the 19th century shell, in a sense, that is now a kind of covering that has no meaning, that should be done away with. So to connect all these aspects to the world of the times, especially in the context of England and Europe. So I think the kind of churning that was taking place in society of so many institutions just kind of falling apart and disintegrating, poetry became an apt medium to actually capture it. And I'm almost reminded of Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway. So it's a character who's, in a sense, there in this present moment, but still is unable to connect. And to the writers, I think poetry provides that connect. And, you know.
Actually, when you were talking about the points raised by T. Hume, and Hume was writing this essay, as you said, or speaking, giving a lecture, he did it in 1909, you said.
1908.
1908. And Eliot at that time would be 23. And within 5 years or 6 years or so, he would write a love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where the outer shell will be broken.
Yes.
Where the pattern will become totally different, and it will be freed from the versification of the earlier period, and that there will be experiment. And the fourth thing that I noted, mentioned by Hume there and done in poetic practice by T.S. Eliot, was that the content would follow the argument of the ordinary person.
Yes.
So the entire love song actually is a love song, is a denial of a love song, is a violence done to the love aspect of life, and yet making a point regarding the modern times. So I believe that the concerns were common and people were moving in a certain direction, and Eliot of course appeared to be experimenting along lines that T. Hume suggested. So this is the 20th century thing, that you don't accept the old thing as the final fact, and you to start playing with it. In fact, you use the word experiment in the first part of the lecture, and where the crux of the modern poetry, 20th century poetry, is experiment. So that's what Eliot does.
Yes. In fact, another very important aspect, something that Ezra Pound kind of dwells on in detail, is that of the image. And he says the image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So image is no longer the picture. Image is the image that the poet creates. Of course, we have the imagists and so on, but it's important to keep this term image in mind, because at times a series of images that we might think do not connect, but then the poet is also saying that they do not connect because the times are such that fragmentation is really speaking the norm, the collapse is the norm. So Pound says it is the presentation of this complex of the emotional and the intellectual that gives a sense of sudden liberation, of freedom from time limits and space limits, a sense of sudden growth. So there is of course immense freedom. We can be we can have different points of view to poetry of the 20th century, but it certainly, I think it's also a realm of freedom where the artist, the poet, the writer, the novelist, they're all kind of trying to do away with the boundaries that maybe the previous century had set out for them, and to move into unexplored terrains. So the sense of sudden growth, he says, it is better to present one image in a lifetime than to produce voluminous works. That is the kind of importance that Pound gave to the image. And here is he says, to kind of conclude Pound, he writes an interesting piece which is called A Few Don'ts by an Imagist. So apart from the fact, he says, no superfluous word should be used, no adjective which does not reveal something. Go in fear of abstractions, and don't retell in mediocre verse what has already been said in good prose. And so he says the expert is tired of today and the public will be tired of tomorrow. So he says be influenced by as many great artists, but have the decency either to acknowledge the debt outright or to try and completely conceal it. So so a lot of these do's and don'ts that he kind of writes in this piece, and one of the most important phrases attributed to Ezra Pound is to break the back of the iron. I think the meter, to break the back of the meter itself is something that Pound says. So which means that we have now moved into a totally different terrain with 20th century poetry, where we are kind of, the writers are, rejecting what had been done and trying to come up with new forms, and the content is also new, and the content is very serious content, because there is a world in which we are having different powers, and there is the world war. So that itself is, I think, kind of giving us a very wide range, and there's a very wide range. I mean, we also have Gerard Manley Hopkins, and we have an Auden, or we have the war poets, like Sassoon and Rupert Brooke, Isaac Rosenberg. We have women poets in the 20th century. So this series is going to allow us to explore, I think, these very different terrains and different ways in which the poets have used the genre of poetry.
And you are suggesting that is going to happen in the 20th century later, in very subtle terms, because you say that Eliot has a future in some kind of experimentation that will continue. And the breaking of the back of the iron became finally Eliot's own aim and his mission.
Yes.
And he started toying with the idea of completely doing away with the iambic pentameter and the poetic form that started from Marlowe and Shakespeare onwards and went up to the 20th century. Himself was using the blank verse at that time, but then he said blank verse will not do. And in the context of the First World War, and the Second World War was not very far away from the first. There was just a question of 25 or so years. So then Eliot, it occurred to me that Eliot has completely done away with the iambic pentameter in his Murder in the Cathedral, and it is full of poems there.
Yes.
And he's talking about the every man's verse, that kind of repetition, which is not there in English poetry at all. So these people were at that point of time becoming conscious of the restrictions that the immediate history had imposed on them, and they were moving left and right, and all the time experimenting and losing their way, not finding their way, but the struggle was to find a way. Like you said, the war poets, they were struggling to find a way.
Yes.
And they went beyond Eliot and Pound, and they saw the world in a wider context, and 20th century poetry became finally a journey of searching for meaning in the second half of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
All that we will take up one by one.
I mean, if you mentioned the war poets, they specifically, poets like Wilfred Owen and Edmund Blunden, they wrote specifically about their experience of the trenches and trench warfare.
Yes. So friends, we are up against the kind of problem that the 20th century poetry will offer as challenges to us, and Dr. Payal Nagpal's lecture and the points she has raised will really help us understand the varied nature of the 20th century poetry and poets. So with that, we come to the conclusion that the series now will pick up important poetic expressions from different poets of the 20th century, and then it will relate itself with the circumstances that emerged in Europe in particular and the world in general. Thank you.